Okay, well, I welcome everybody for being here. And today it's March 20th, 2022. And this is a presentation that for the FANHS Museum. And if hopefully, mostly everybody here is familiar with FANHS, the Filipino-American National Historical Society, and in which was started in 1982, and they're celebrating their 40th anniversary this year. Now there are 40 chapters across the United States. There's archives in the National Archives in Seattle, and now a national museum located in Stockton. And we opened up the museum in 2016. And this is the place to showcase the Filipino-American history in the United States. So most of our volunteers, there's a lot of our volunteers that are watching, and everybody is a volunteer. No one gets paid in all of FANHS. So we appreciate everybody's patience and we everybody's dedication to keep the museum going and keeping FANHS going. So a few years ago, Mina came to Stockton and was met with Anita Bautista, and she's fortunately on our call today. And Anita showed Mina around and while she was doing the research that she needed. So we're happy now that this research has culminated into a book that everybody's available to uh, to buy it. So I don't want to talk too long about that, but because I want Mina to really discuss her book. And there's a lot of interesting things in there, especially how she went about researching and everything that she found out about the Filipinos immigrating to the different parts of the world. So, so Mina, I'll let you go ahead and introduce yourself, tell a little bit about yourself, and then we can get into doing the talk about your book.
Thank you, Terry. Appreciate that. I'm Mina Roces, and I'm a historian. I'm really a Philippine specialist, and I'm known for my work on women's history in the Philippines, 20th century. So I've just had a new book out, which is absolutely free for download from Cambridge University Press, called Gender in Southeast Asia, which is a significant section in the Philippines. So everybody interested in how the ideal men and women are constructed in the Philippines and the rest of South, and how we're similar to the rest of Southeast Asia. That's it. And so I usually write about women's history. The previous book in 2012 was on the women's movements in the Philippines. And so I wanted to write about the Filipino migration around the world because most writing in social science is always about the disenfranchised Filipino laborer, and I was sort of being a migrant myself, that is not, I wanted to write something different. And then I know that Filipino-American studies is a big field now in academia, but it's relatively new. And I wanted to bring two fields together, Filipino-American studies and Philippine migration studies together. So I'm really a Philippine specialist, and this is my first time to write about Filipino-American history. The original book was supposed to go from 1906 to 2018, but because the Cornell, one of the referees, who I suspect is not a historian, wanted me to remove 50 years because there was an imbalance of more Filipino-American than the rest of the world. But I thought, logically, of course, Filipino-American migration is more than 100 years, whereas the rest of the world is only 50. But of course, I had to make the changes. So luckily, some of the earlier chapters were published in articles as well. So that's me. I'm really a historian, and I'm really a Philippine specialist, but I wanted to write about migration. And for the first time, I've written about Filipino-American history, which I thought was absolutely fascinating. So.
Okay, one of the questions that we had was, how was the title of your book derived? You know, this Agents of Change.
The first thing I thought when I did the research, which took quite a long time, and I have to apologize for having almost 10 years a member of FANHS. That's how long it's taken, because it took the whole world, and I'll talk about sources in a minute later. but I wanted to see how instead of looking at Filipinos as disenfranchised labor, if you look at the Filipino migrants from the Philippine migrants' perspective, because a lot of those who write about Filipino migration write from the perspective of the nation, and they talk about migrants and how they send remittances home and how that helps the Philippines and so on, how they're new heroes because they send money. But actually, if you use sources that come from the migrants themselves, what kind of a perspective would appear? And the first thing I thought is that the title of my book comes from my main argument that migrants are agents of change, that they can change cultural constructions of gender, for example, since I'm a gender historian. They've reinvented the family, the Filipino sacred family. They broke the taboos about criticizing the family. Why? Because they have a track record for supporting the family, so they have the right to do it. They change social norms. You guys all send the balikbayan boxes. In fact, it was invented by Filipino-Americans, but you're not expecting them to give back gifts to you, whereas Filipino culture expects you to return. And also they're entrepreneurs, they're consumers. People haven't thought about the fact that they have consumer money. Their money as consumers changes things. The Filipino channel is supported by them. Whatever they buy, businesses thrive. They're also activists and philanthropists. Oh, hello, Auntie Anita. I haven't seen her in a long time.
Can you see me?
Yes.
I can't see anybody.
Oh, I can see you. Big hug. I miss you. I haven't seen
I love you.
like my mom. So, it's because of Auntie Anita that I've done most of this work. So thank you. I'm so happy to see her. So Filipinos are also philanthropists. So they send medical missions to the Philippines. They do a lot of good work in the area of charity. And of course, what's unique about FANHS, which I'll talk about later, is that they're also historians of their own past. And that is something that scholars haven't even thought about, that you can, and it's not just Filipino Americans. You get a lot of migrants all over the world writing their own stories using pseudonyms, Filipino domestic workers and so on, in Tagalog. Most of them are in Filipino. So they are historians of their own past as well. And in this case, they changed both the homeland, the Philippines, and the host countries they migrated to. People normally don't think that marginal groups can change the host countries, and I wanted to argue that they can, and they have done here. So I wanted to change that perception. So in what ways are they global agents of change? Well, in the level of the personal, for example, the migration stories that I have read, a lot of the ones from domestic workers in particular in Tagalog and Filipino, they don't just record a change in the economic position of their family, but it's also about their individual transformation. And I call it Filipino Migrant 2.0. If you look at, for example, the story of Zita Cabayes, who was born in Pangasinan, the second of 9 children, born to a poor farming family. She was forced to stop her schooling at the finished grade 6 only because her parents needed her to work to support the other kids. She worked as a maid in Manila from the age of 13 and became a clerk in a pharmacy. She married, had 2 kids, and then in 1994 went to France as an illegal, undocumented migrant to earn a living as a domestic worker. She only received 2,000 francs out of the 6,000 francs monthly salary. So she was the first Filipina in France to file a civil case against her employer on the grounds of modern slavery. And she won. Her efforts made her a celebrity in the Philippines and in France. The First Lady of France sent her a letter, and a television company followed her to the Philippines. And now she's been invited to be the person in the French trade union, and that's her job, to help other migrants also with similar cases that she had. So when she told me her story in Paris, it was with an enormous amount of pride and self-awareness of her transformation from a domestic worker with primary school qualifications to a union worker who advocates for all marginal workers in Paris. And this is not just a one story. People say, oh, that's unusual. I've got stories of Filipino domestic workers in Singapore who joined the NGO Migrant Home, humanitarian organization for migrant economics, and they went to Geneva and addressed the United Nations closed door session on fair, decent work for domestic workers. So you can see, would they have undergone these changes if they never left the Philippines? And I'm arguing each migrant, including myself, when you leave the country, you actually transform yourself. You have to adjust. And that is kind of the first, so that's a personal level. And then the second level, they also change the homeland. For example, consumption, if you look at the little town in Italy, which if we have time later, I can show photos. The Filipino workers domestic workers in Padova built Italian villas in the province of Laguna to copy their employers. So they are changing that. Their salaries, when converted from euros to pesos, becomes big. So the real estate boom in the Philippines is fueled by migration. Filipino-Americans buy a lot of condominiums, I'm told, from some of them from Rockwell, the Lopez-owned company. And so that changes the real estate. So if you look at real estate companies, they all have branches in San Francisco and London because they know migrants, and they set aside 40% because it's a Philippine law. You can't have more than 40% owned by foreigners there. The Filipino channel, for example, the revenue of ABS-CBN is from the Filipino channel, which is 40% actually of their revenue. And that was the time I saw Elena and Auntie Anita, because I interviewed Rafi Lopez of the Filipino channel in San Francisco, and he didn't want me to tell you the exact amount because he didn't want his competitors to know, but it's more than $100 million, and it comes from you. And it's the Filipino-Americans who first spent $1,000 on the satellite dishes that actually spearheaded the Filipino channel. So they affect that. Now, do they affect the host country? I say they do. So I have a case study of the Filipino Women's Working Party in Australia. Australia is a bit different from the rest of the world because a lot of Filipinos here came here as brides in the 1980s as marriage migrants, and a lot of them became victims of domestic violence. So the Filipino Women's Working Party in Australia changed the migration law so that if you are a victim of domestic violence and you haven't fulfilled 2 years of permanent residency, you go to a shelter and they will give you permanent residency and you will not be deported. So Filipinos changed the law in Australia. And the other law that they changed is white Australian men tended to sponsor several Filipino brides, and so they put a limit on that serial sponsorship to 2. In Hawaii, Operation Manong, which is an affirmative action group, I did a case study on them. They tutored Filipinos in high school so that they could enter the university system. This is volunteer work, some of it for credit, and it became so successful that it's now no longer called Operation Manong. It's now the Office of Multicultural Services, and they help all migrants. So all these Filipino groups that started helping Filipinos end up losing their Filipino identity, but it just means they help more people. And finally, they also have an impact on the homeland. They are great philanthropists. I've done a case study on the Philippine International Aid in San Francisco, which has sent scholarships to street children to keep children off the streets. I myself noticed over the years, why are there fewer street children in Manila? Maybe that's part of it. And so they, from 1986 to 2013, they provided scholarships for street children and gave 38,000 children scholarships costing US $3 million. This is you guys. Now, I did a case study in Australia. The Filipino-Australian Medical Association sends medical missions every year to a remote town in the Philippines. So I know that the Filipino-American doctors in Australia do the same thing. There's a great free film called Bloodlines that talks about it, but I wanted to have a Australian counterpart. So these people actually provide free healthcare to the poorest of the poor in the Philippines. So they changed the Philippines one hometown at a time. So that's why I thought that they would be agents of change.
Also, you were going to discuss like the sources that you used.
Yes.
Yeah.
What sources did I use? Because the challenge is to write the story from the perspective of migrants. And I use sources that haven't been used before, and I have the privilege of doing it with some help of people like FANHS. Migrants have written their memoirs in several languages, English, Tagalog, Italian so far. They've got newsletters, websites, social media, and I did more than 70 interviews. It's very sad that 3 of the people I've interviewed have since passed away. Uncle Fred Cordova and Uncle Bob Santos, who Uncle Bob took me around in International District in Seattle. And I'm just so sorry he didn't get to see the book. So the other sources, of course, the standout, of course, are FANHS. Why? Because, and I can see my book is out of date because when it went to press, you had 38 chapters, and now I hear you've got 40. So, and I know you have plans to expand to Canada, which because of the reading the minutes that Terry so religiously sent to me for 10 years. I read them. And of course, you have your own archive, in Seattle, and you've published your own community histories. You've published life histories in your regular newsletters. You have biannual conferences. You taught yourselves how to be historians, and you even launched your own museum. So you're the only Filipino museum, I think, outside the Philippines, right? And I also noticed that you are the biggest supporters of Filipino culture. So that's why someone said to me, I think Linda Nietes from California, that we need to promote your book in California, which is quite interesting. They didn't say in the Philippines. So you're best supporters of Filipino culture. So you also produce documentaries, which I've seen, and I've missed a few because they came out since the book went to press. And so I think that also the sources that comes from FANHS comes from an activist position, and that the theme that I see also, why are migrants spending time writing their memoirs, publishing it? Why does FANHS spend hours and hours of your volunteer time? I looked at some of your publications, and you even had an index committee for in her uncle's words, or in my auntie's words, they even have a committee for the index. They spend hours of time going to you spend your own money, you donate. The museum was completely from your donations. You spend hours organizing it. You go to a conference every year. So why do migrants do this? And I think it's because migrants want their contributions to the homeland and to the host country acknowledged and appreciated. Because at the moment, I know there's this fear that the Filipino-Americans are invisible. Same in Australia, Filipino migrants. 1/4 of the nurses in Australia are Filipinos, and yet the Australians have no clue because we're the good migrant. If we did something terrible, the Australians might notice us, right? So it's the idea that we want our contributions acknowledged and appreciated by the Philippines and also by the host countries, and that's the reason. So that's why FANHS lobbied to have Filipino-American History Month approved in the US, and you've succeeded it. So I've argued in my chapter on FANHS that you've done a truly history from below, and that is actually a good thing. Historians have been criticized for writing only about the elites and writing about the leaders and the top down, and they always say the real history should come from the voices of the people who lived through it. And so they always say, yeah, but how do we find sources to write the real history of the people from below? I think FANHS has done it. You have written your own history. You've trained yourselves to be historians of your own past, and you have your own interpretation of your history. And you want your voices heard. And I'm quoting from Terry Jamero, who's now passed away, I think, former president of FANHS, quote, "If we do not tell our own story, then others will tell it for us as they interpret it, and we will risk losing the essence and the truth about the Filipino-American experience." And I can relate to that because I was trying to get the article published, and Auntie Anita was helping me with sources, and the readers, it was rejected. And one of the reasons they said was I was writing about Cowboy in the 1920s and 30s. And, oh, you shouldn't be writing anything that's sort of negative about the Filipino experience. And Auntie Anita said, "Oh, but that happened." Yes, but you know, you if they rejected it, I can't put it out. I'll have to wait an appropriate time. But there you go. There you've got the historians from above and the people who actually lived it. And there's a tension between the two into which perspective gets published. And so it's good that you want your own voices and you're telling your own story in your own words. Now, what about the other sources? Filipino domestic workers publish their life stories using pseudonyms because some of the stories criticize their family for always asking for money and not saying thank you. So they don't want that their names associated with that. So the only way to criticize the family is to do it without using your own name. They've also published their life stories, and then a lot of their stories also appear in newsletters of migrants organizations. Even migrant children have there's a lovely book here, we can just see, of paintings of children in the Middle East. So children also tell their stories through paintings. So there's a big a drive for migrants to tell their stories. I also, as I said, I've also done oral histories with over 70 Filipinos from Singapore, Hong Kong, Greece, Italy, and the US. So the idea is because the next project is also connected to migrants, but focusing on women only. The next one. And I did ethnographic work, including joining coming of age celebrations, the debuts of Filipinos in Padua. One of them cost 5,000 euros, the daughter of Filipino domestic workers. So I have to manage to get myself invited into these. And Elena so kindly, Elena Mangas took me to the Filipino International Aid fundraiser, which is also the case study of the book. So I managed to do some ethnographic work with the help of a lot of people. I also attended the financial literacy seminars because in the Philippines, the perspective is, well, if you look at the migrants' perspective, they want to help the family so much that they get into debt. So there's some financial literacy seminars to teach the migrants how to say no, which I think is very hard. If you look at even the Filipino-American experience, people like the memoir of Philip Vera Cruz will say he sent all his brothers to school, to college, and they did okay, and he died poor. I mean, there's this view that, and so these financial literacy seminars are training them how to say no, which I think is very hard because that means you're, walang hiya. I mean, you're what is that? Shameless, and therefore you're not going to be, you'll be ostracized. So they also have seminars for the family left behind to let them know that every dollar that they send back to the Philippines is a great sacrifice for the migrants because they haven't a clue. I remember when I gave a lecture at Berkeley and Auntie Anita and Elena were there, thank God, because they supported me. There was somebody in the audience, it was about how Filipino migrants criticized the family for being exploitative and asking. And somebody in the audience who was a Filipino migrant, I think, he said, "Oh, but Mina, the reason we send, that's the reason we send them away in the first place, to send us money." And so you see the perspective from the nation is that. And so Auntie Anita and Elena stood up and told them off. But the thing is, you can't keep you can't expect the migrants to just because they were sent abroad, the expectation that they have to keep sending is also very hard from the migrants' perspective.
Okay, so another question you had was, or we were wondering, what makes the Filipino-Americans unique from other Filipinos who immigrated to other countries? Well, some of it you talked about, the history from below and
yes,
the pride.
that's one. And then the longer history of 100 years. Another one that's definitely different is you have already, because you've 100-year history of several generations, you already have clearly formed a new identity of Philippine-American. What they call Phil-Foreign, Filipino-Australian, Filipino-Greek, is still happening. So if you go to Greece, there's an organization called Filipinas Hellas, which is Greek, but there's still it's not, they still haven't fashioned a Filipino Greek or Filipino Ita, whereas you clearly have a distinct identity, Filipino-American, which is different from Filipino. That's true, that's for sure. And then the other difference is that, apart from the history below, is that there's some similarities in that the only other place I found that was interested in their own history is in Hong Kong. There's a NGO called Lakbay Dangal, which is literally Journey of Dignity, where Filipino domestic workers are trained by a priest and another person to collect their stories in the journals, and they give you a free, you just donate, Filipino Historical Trail of Hong Kong, and they take you to where Jose Rizal, the national hero, stayed in Hong Kong and so on. But that's the only other place I saw that had a similar thing. Filipinos have, Filipino-Americans have the richest archives and the only one with a museum. And you do have the Filipino-American Society of Hawaii as well, but they're also collecting digital archives and so on. And also I noticed that you have your own interpretation of the past compared to but it's and that is that you had what I call a heroic narrative of struggle and survival, that the first generation struggled and survived so that the next generations could live a better life. And it is true, you can see that from lower class, working class to middle class, although it's true that the next wave of 1960s Filipino Americans are also already middle class professionals. But I also find that Filipino Americans have a pride in their, I think it comes from the FANHS work and the activism of the Filipino American movement, that you have a pride in your ancestors in the lower class, which I find different. Filipinos, so if you remember, Imelda Marcos didn't like it when her biography came out and they said that she was poor and lived in the garage. A lot of Filipinos don't want to claim that, they want to show that they're from de buena familia and were always rich and invent a kind of, but I find it amazing. Filipino Americans are very proud that they have ancestors that were working class, that built America with their sweat and I resonate with that because Australia, I come from Australian perspective, and here in Australia, people are proud of their convict past. I can trace my relative to the convict, because Australia was a penal colony, who came here as a convict and then built Australia afterwards, because they did. So I find it quite fascinating because it's not the same as the Philippines or elsewhere. It's like Australia. That's why I find it resonating, and this pride is also different.
Let's see. Some of it you already touched on, the consumerism as the agents of change. That was one of the next topics that we were going to talk about.
Oh, I can just add a little bit. Your impact, I think the migrants' big impact is as consumers, because the consumer dollar. And this is not so much discussed by historians and scholars, or even social science who write about the post-70s migration that's global. There's a little bit on it in Filipino-American scholarship about the Filipinos who like to go to the movies in the 20s, 30s, 40s, which I used to write that article in the Macintosh suit. But there's really not much. They always talk about the Filipino channel in terms of how it forms an identity, but I think the Filipino channel makes a lot of money because of you guys. The other one is Filipino domestic workers in Singapore are addicted to Tagalog romance novels. And therefore, that's why the history of the book in the Philippines, they make a lot of money for that. The other thing is you guys send balikbayan boxes every year. And because of that, and it was invented by Filipino Americans, this invented tradition that you send the gifts every year. It's been analyzed that it helps connect you with a community. It allows you to be filial children and siblings to be sending gifts home. But it makes a lot of money for all these couriers who are now global around the world. If I read issues of the OFW Pinoy Star magazine in Singapore, and all the advertisements are LBC Courier and A-Freight, all these courier companies. I interviewed some of these courier companies, and they say they even have a warehouse to let people bring in, because these are domestic workers, right? To bring in their goods a little at a time, anything, but it makes them a lot of money. So I think as consumers, they have a lot of power. I think in the US, you have all these Filipino-American food businesses also, which we don't have in Australia so much or elsewhere. And that comes from your consumer power.
Okay. One of the next questions was about critiquing the family and also sexuality issues, how women are treated in the different host countries and their perceptions, I guess. And then how the family has changed from the ones that left behind, how they formed in the other countries.
Okay. I'll do the family one first. Unfortunately, I had to remove the 50 years from my book, but in that first part, I had how Filipino migrants have actually transformed the family and reinvented it. So in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, you had this fraternal organizations, the Gran Oriente, the Filipino Federation of America, Caballeros de Dimasal. Those that's the invention of a new family. This became the family for the migrants because they were here. It's all men, but it was their family. You have a similar pattern in the 70s. If you look at migrant stories of domestic workers in Singapore and Hong Kong and Taiwan, they will tell you that that the NGO is their family. Why? Because the NGO is the one who supports them. Sorry, I was going to look for a picture. Do I have that? Hang on. Here it is. Okay, let's see if I can share screen. Oops. Is that working? Share screen? Okay.
We don't see anything yet.
Okay,
There.
you see that? Okay, that's a journal from a Filipino domestic worker in Hong Kong. And this is what she said is her family. And it's the Father Reyes is the founder of the NGO, Miss Susut and Professor Vim teach them about Filipino history. And all the members of the group are her family. So you can see that she defines a family as the people who are with you during your birthday, your Christmas, and the people who actually support you. Because when these people are in trouble, the Philippine embassy doesn't help them, their family doesn't usually, and it's the NGO that helps them. So that's one way they transform the family. The other way they transform the family is post-70s, there's something called the Transnational Family, with a mother away and the father in the Philippines. It's now common to have this happen. And so they've also changed that. But for me, the most important thing that they've done that's interesting is that they've actually critiqued the family. So all these stories will tell you that there's a nice story from America, from San Diego, where the guy says, you never receive letters from home unless they ask you for money, the family. They're not going to write you and ask you how you are, which I thought was very sad. And in my interview, I went to a birthday party of Filipino domestic workers in Singapore, and one of them who was left the Philippines illegally because you had to be 21, was 19, supported her family for years. And then she said, I just want my family. And then you send money, and then they keep texting, when's the money coming? When's the money coming? And then constant texting. And then in one interview with a Filipino domestic worker in Singapore, her son kept asking her for money. So I said, how old is he? She said 45. I nearly had a heart attack. This is and they keep asking for money, but when they get the money, they don't get a thank you. So this people will say, I want my family to just say, how are you? And not ask me for any money. So I think that's a pretty damning, I mean, Filipinos think the family is holy. You're never supposed to criticize the family. In the Philippine end, they give awards for the best overseas Filipino family, which is the family that even if they're separated, they're still together. There's no divorce in the Philippines. It's one of only 3 countries in the world that don't have divorce. So I think this is quite radical. So that's the family. And now that I've got the screen, before I do sexuality, I'll show some photos before I stop sharing. Oops. So you can see some of the photos. This is the one I wanted to see. This is Auntie Anita took me to the Stockton Cemetery. So this is my crappy photography. And she took me to this gravesite, which I thought was great because this gravesite actually tells you the whole Filipino-American story. So in this, sorry, oh, it says here, rest, dear daddy. Oh, it's too big. Yeah, rest, dear daddy, your journey is over. You left the Philippines at the age of 17 in search of riches and adventure, but discovered a life of a lifetime of backbreaking poverty and prejudice instead. In other people's fields you trudged, pausing only long enough to love and nurture the family that you started so late in your quest. And I thought this is the Filipino-American story, but it also shows, there it is. Rest, dear daddy, your journey's over. But discovered a lifetime of backbreaking poverty, and in other people's fields you trudged, pausing only long enough to love it. So here you go. That is, I consider that a primary source. Even in the gravesite, they're gonna write their story. So this is ABS-CBN, which became international because of migrant consumer power here. This is in San Francisco. These are the Italian villas. It's an hour and a half from Manila and Laguna. These are empty because the migrant is in Italy as a domestic worker, hoping to return home once every 2 years on a holiday. And if you look at inside the houses, you can see it's all stuff from abroad, Italy. Here they have a bar, but I discovered nobody drinks alcohol, so it's just copying their employer. And here they've got bidets, which you don't have in the Philippines, but you do in Italy, which they learn to use. This is also, some of the employers give them their whole kitchen because they renew their kitchen and then the migrant sends it home. You see there's a veranda here, like in Italy, but of course in the Philippines, you can't use it and they can't because of all the mosquitoes. So I thought it was interesting. And of course in the kitchen, I noticed that they had Italian cookies and here's a photo of a debut that cost 5,000 euros. And all the clothes came from the Philippines, of course. So if you're talking about the Filipino men in America who in the 20s and 30s who spent $100 to look nice in a suit, here's the other end of today, Filipino domestic workers in Italy spending money for a debut. This is another debut also that and here, if you look at the couriers, they're playing on your consumer power and connecting consumption with love. So how do the norms change in the Philippines? One, when you send gifts, you're not expected to get one in return. And that's very un-Filipino, usually reciprocity. You give a gift and they give it something back. But here it's becoming money and gifts equals love. So here, LBC advertises, dear baby Chloe, your favorite toys is here inside and your mother loves you very much. But it's connected to here, hello child, I hope you can feel how much I love you when you open this gift. I'm not there for your birthday, but I'm always here for you. But you can see the gift is now being associated with love. That's another change. And here you've got, I just couldn't help myself. This is in Singapore, where Filipinos buy a lot of Tagalog romance novels. Domestic workers buy a lot of, sorry, this is still the Italian house. The other thing is the migrants send a lot of money here. They donated it to their town waterworks. So that in that way, they're also sending not just remittances, but a way to build the houses. Okay, I'll stop. How do we stop sharing? Stop share. There you go. Click the button. All right. So that's and finally, you asked about gender and sexuality. it's a bit, I couldn't find much in the Filipino-American sources about the topic of sexuality, but I found some in the Filipino domestic workers stuff. And there are memoirs about Filipino domestic workers in Singapore having romantic liaisons with South Asian men. And so they invented a category of themselves called the single wife, because of course they're married women. And I'm not looking at it as I'm looking at it as a gender historian. In the Philippines, men are allowed to have affairs, right? It's tolerated, but Filipino women must be chaste wives. So I'm not looking at it in a negative light. This apparently happens also in the Middle East. I'm looking at it from the perspective that these women actually challenge definitions of the feminine as the chaste wife, and are able to have romantic lives, and that's very radical. Men also do it. There's a lovely memoirs in English you can read on, written by Ray Ventura, 2 books, it's autobiographical, but it's about Filipinos in Japan who work as day construction workers, and they have families in Japan and they also have families in the Philippines. So you've got that happening as well with the men. But for the first time, I thought it was amazing that you have Filipino women who are wives who also have romantic liaisons in Singapore, and they write about it. And when you read the memoirs, I was surprised myself, and she said, I've had boyfriends, and so it was. And they know that it's not going to lead to another romantic family, which is again radical in itself. I mean, they see it's sort of like what Filipino men do, and so it's like the women are have done something that only the men could get away with in the Philippines, but they could do it overseas. So that's a section on gender.
Okay. That was basically all the questions that we had discussed before, but if there's something else that you'd want to cover that you'd like to touch on, is there anything else that you wanted to cover? And then we can do questions and answers.
I thought it might be a good time to ask if anyone wants.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, people, you can unmute and ask some questions now if you like.
I want to come in because this is the last subject that you talked about, the Balikbayan box.
Yes.
Mina, this is Elena.
Yes.
The upside of this Balikbayan box for Filipinos who are working in the Middle East, Dubai and all those other places, the Muslim Filipinos actually are able to send Ramadan food to their community. So there's that activism, yes. And at the same time, it's actually kind of like a savior of sending nuts, dates and other things that are readily available in the Middle East, and they send them via LBC boxes to their communities during the Ramadan. So it's like feeding the Muslim community in a very special way, 1 week every year.
Yes, that's very nice. I didn't know about that. So thank you.
I will introduce you to the lady who's doing it.
That's very good. So that specifically to the Ramadan, yes. And also it's a special meaning because what Filipinos or migrants are trained to say is, oh, I ate like the ones in Italy, oh, I ate this particular Italian chocolate and they don't have it in the Philippines, but I would like to share that experience with my family. So it's one way of sharing the new things that you have with the family. So it's definitely connecting. That's why people do it. You connect with the homeland and you show your filial. But this is interesting. If they're not even related, but they're sending it to show, like you said, an activist, show empathy for, and of course the Philippines now celebrates Ramadan, which it didn't before. Which I thought was interesting, because when I went to do research, the librarian said to me, you realize tomorrow is Eid and the library's closed. And of course, I had no idea. So, I thought it was good now that I have to put it in my calendar when that this is now officially celebrated. Thank
Yes, yes, yeah. All right.
Does anybody else have a question they'd like to ask or a comment?
Yes,
Or-
may I?
Okay, go.
Hi, Mina. I'm Victoria, and congratulations for a
Thank you.
phenomenal achievement. And thank you for doing this for all of us.
Thank you.
To have our kumbaga, yung community story told in such a scientific work. I think it's interesting because I write fiction. So I write poetry and fiction. And of course, works like yours are my sources for my work.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
So I'm definitely going to get a book.
Thank you. So you put, yes, I know your works use ours for the context. That's right.
Exactly.
Yes, the
Exactly.
context.
But I also use fiction as a way to educate about the real history of Filipinos.
Yes.
You know,
We all
because
know
like,
how powerful it is. Sometimes more powerful. Like Jose Rizal's
exactly.
book. Until now, we still discuss the afterlives of Maria Clara, and obviously it was an enduring book even for gender, right? So fiction is actually more power because your work lasts longer than ours.
Well, they say
work,
that
somebody else builds on my work and it'll be out of date, right? Terry just told me there's 40 chapters.
I think there's something subliminal to it because for a fiction writer like myself, we tell our story, we tell the story through what they say, the fictional dream, the suspension of disbelief.
Yes.
So for me, the challenge is how do you get people, for instance, I'm in the United States, how do you get Americans to be interested in the story of Filipinos? So what I do is I go straight into the intersections between Philippine and American history and use that to reel in Americans to want to read this novel of mine. You weren't here earlier, but I wrote a novel that's upcoming, going to be released in April next year. It's called The Homicide, and it's about the more than 500 American teachers who came to the Philippine Islands.
So you have read Sarah Steinbach Brock's book?
I'm sorry?
So you have read Sarah Steinbach Pratt's book on the schoolhouse and empire?
I read many books. I did not read that in the original. It may have been a footnote in some of the sources that I read, but I certainly read a lot of original.
Yes, there's a lot of material on that.
That's
a great idea.
Which really, right. But you know what? There weren't too many, apart from Helen Fee, who wrote memoirs.
Memoirs, yes.
Yes, they wrote more like essay-like, academic-like, but not in a very personal way like their everyday lives. But I did get like copies of postcards where they wrote to family and friends in the United States about their lives in the Philippines. Little snippets,
Well done.
right? Vignettes, right? So anyway, so my question pertains exactly to, I already have an idea for a book because of what you said.
Oh, great. I'm happy about that. Well,
so what's one of the things I'm intrigued by a lot of what you said, but one of those things is I find this kind of really bombastic Filipinos in Japan having families in Japan and in the Philippines.
Yes.
And so I'm curious. How do these families know about each other?
No,
and how does the family in the Philippines react if they know this? Or does the Filipino worker has he or she gotten so good that they manage somehow to not let the two families know?
In Japan, you might want, this is a Raventura underground in Japan and into the country of standing men. That's where I got the stuff about he will tell you in this when he interviews, I think it's based on interviews with and also he lived with the Filipinos in an area called Cotobuki, where he calls them standing men because you're illegal and you get a job by the day. You stand up there and they decide to hire you for the day in construction. Okay. Some of the wives know about it and they tacitly accept it as long as he keeps sending remittances. So I think I didn't investigate this more in this book, but it's something to be investigated on. Are Filipinos willing to tolerate this now for the sake of the remittances? Is definitely a moral, and you love it because it'll give you ideas for your book. It says there I quoted some of it in my book, which says this, if you're a migrant, right? Nobody polices you. You live underground. You're illegal. You're having this family here. You don't tell the Philippines back. And the guy says he legitimizes his dalliances by saying, "What am I supposed to do? Pickle my dick?" It's actually a quote from here. So they feel that they can do it as long as they send money back. But then the author Raventura asks, so who polices the migrant? Where do the morals come from? What moral compass do you use now, since you're kind of underground? And it's true that it's not openly, like, people still do it discreetly, but they know it actually happens. At least in Japan, these two memoirs you'll see. I think it was published by Ateneo University Press.
Okay.
So that's how I got
Try to trace that.
Ventura.
May I just ask one more question, because it's related with what you just said about,
Sure.
One of the things that I struggle with when I write about Filipinos is, do I have an obligation to tell the truth all the time, even if it is to the disadvantage of the image of the Filipino? Because I've taken it upon myself that my mission as a writer, as a Filipino-American writer, is to help take the Filipino out of the shadows and into mainstream, as a mainstream and well-represented character in literature. And I struggle because what I find, because I also am like you, I also love to ask, whenever I meet Filipinos anywhere in the world, I ask about their stories.
Yes.
And the thing that bothers me, one of the things that really bothers me is the materialism that comes from this lifestyle of migrant workers, going abroad so that they can send money home, And so my question to you is, what is your opinion? Has this materialism always been in the Filipino character, or is this an effect of global capitalism and the way it pulls the Filipino migrant worker to where the jobs are?
That's a hard, difficult question, Loaded. So I won't directly answer it, but I'll give you some different levels. And some people argue that this materialism come according to the NGOs. There's an NGO called Atikha that runs these financial literacy seminars, and the first thing they talk about is exactly your point about materialism. Why is it that their value is that's because the mother's away, she's feeling guilty, so she's going to send her daughter the latest iPhone, and the daughter asks for another computer and she'll send it. So and that's because of guilt, and therefore it's becomes a mention of love. So these NGOs are actually running in the financial literacy seminar a values component, which says what is your family aim? The family aim is not so much just building a new house and getting the kids to school. The family aim should be for mother to come back home. And therefore, if mother has to come back home, we cannot spend anything on luxury things. And we should have to budget together as a family. So you are right in pointing out that there's this materialism that's happening, that's a product of migration. That's absolutely right. I noticed that. I don't know whether it was always there or not, but I do know that it's been observed by NGOs, and they explain it by the guilt of being away. And so you send stuff, but it's sort of had a life of its own after a while, right? It's become so extreme. I can see that because the migrants get in debt. You go to the Philippines and everyone expects you to spend for them. And you know, I mean, that's really, and then they feel they have to because they show. Otherwise, you might look like a failed migrant. And you want to prove that you suffered and it was worth it, and how to do it. Oh well, look, I'm successful now, and it's expressed through materialism. And you're right. That if you look at the NGOs, Atika, and what they talk about, they want to change this materialism, which they see happening. At least you can argue it's been accelerated due to migration, because you know, migrants, Filipino domestic workers, and for example, Filipino domestic workers told me in interviews in Italy that every girl's dream is a Louis Vuitton bag. And I had to hide my super cheap bag bought in the department store, right? And for me, I'm an academic, right? So that's kind of whoa. But you wouldn't. I don't think Filipinos said that before, right? But it's a sign of them expressing that they're cosmopolitan now.
Yeah.
They want to buy what their employer has. They're just mimicking their employers. So in a way, it's a sign of cosmopolitanism and status that you can have these goods. But on the other hand, you're right. I just thought I wouldn't, you know, every girl's dream. My God, that's saying something, you know. So I think you're right that there is this. You can argue maybe in your book that there's just this acceleration of materialism that's happened because I think migrants are the new middle class. Remember, for a long time, the Philippines didn't have a big middle class, but now migrants can be a middle class, and therefore they have to express their new status. So I hope that answers. Yeah, I don't.
Yes, thank you so much.
Mina, when we had a little discussion before, we also talked about America being the land of plenty.
Yes.
Plenty. And that has always been the thinking of the Filipinos, even from the way back when the pioneer Filipinos arrived here.
Yes.
And so I also have my ethnographic sources on this, having read the letters in Visayan coming out of those trunks that were discovered.
I'm so impressed that you have got those trunks. Somebody should write a book. Victoria, there, have a look at those trunks. Those primary sources.
And those letters were written in the 1930s. And they are
I would love to see those letters. I think I'd have to maybe stay with my cousin Annie in Stockton, so I can do my big research.
If you can get some funding to digitize those letters,
they will.
And that be forever recorded and not, you know, they won't fall apart.
That's a good idea. Then you can just email them to me.
A digitized copy of those letters. So along the line of that discussion, there are two things that comes out of the point that you were making, Victoria, is the land of plenty mentality has always been there, because those letters actually were all acknowledgement of, at least they acknowledged before, Mina. Thank you for what you sent.
Oh, thank God you say that.
Yeah, so and so went to Manila, went to school, etc. Or we were able to capitalize on a sari-sari store, stuff like that. Those are the only two that I read. And the other thing is a PX worship. We did worship the PX because that's what the Americans introduced to us. And yesterday we had a visitor in the museum wanting to know what the Filipinos' reactions are of the American occupation. And I said, it taught us a PX worship. How we sell goods that are made in the USA. And that was to us a class thing to aim for, is to get shampoo from America. You know, but anyway, those are my itty bit answers. Victoria, we can carry on with this
Right.
conversation later on.
Yeah, yeah. I just, I'm in Seattle, so I'm in the
okay.
Seattle area. Although I actually live on an island, so I
Oh,
have to
nice.
ride a vapor to go to the
Nice.
mainland. We
Very
call
nice.
the U.S. the mainland. But I wonder if there are materials like that. You mentioned a Seattle museum and library with Mina.
And the University of Washington has the Carlos Bolosan papers, which I looked at.
Oh,
And they also have a few papers in there. I forget which other ones. Of course, the National Pinoy Archives. You need to contact Auntie Dorothy Cordova. When I went there twice, I had to work around her schedule because she's just volunteering. It's quite hard. The other point, Elena was saying about, it's true that I'm not saying that the migrants feel the family doesn't appreciate them. I'm sure that there are a lot of you also get a few stories of that say that, because someone sent this off, I became, I got something. If you read, for example, the stories of children from the Philippine International Aid, the children are very because of them, they got a college degree, and one of them even works for Médecins Sans Frontières. I thought it was amazing, supported by Philippine International Aid, but once a street child. But I just feel that the migrants, Tagalog, hinanakit. How do you say that in English?
yeah.
Grudges and terrible feelings of pain. Is that they most of them complain that they're being taken for granted. But you're absolutely right about the taste, colonial mentality that comes from that, from 500, almost 500 years of colonial rule. And so for this next project, I was thinking of looking at the Filipino women as consumers, because women are the ones who decide what to buy. And of course, there's a little bit of tension. There's tension there between buying foreign. If you look at, I think Rene Arquiz's book, Taste of Control, which just came out a couple of years ago, talks about how, and I looked at all the advertisement in the 1950s in the Woman's Home magazine, and it's all carnation milk and American products, and you have to buy the canned pineapple from Dole instead of the real Filipino pineapple in the shop, in the wet market. So there's been that colonial, but there's also been the other tension where there's been like the national economic protection that says buy Filipino. So you've always found this tension. So even those Filipino domestic workers in Italy who like Louis Vuitton bags, when it's the special, they told me that they can make all the Italian sauces. And when I was invited to their house, they didn't serve me a Filipino meal. It was Italian, roast veal and bigoli with, which is a special thick pasta from Padova, with seafood, with mussels. But when they have a special occasion, it'll be Filipino food. So I asked why, because Filipino food is special. So I think they all have this tension between buying foreign that's exotic and a sign of your being cosmopolitan and part of the colonial heritage, but they also have another side of them that on special occasions they'll wear a terno and a barong Tagalog, and they'll have Filipino food. So it's a kind of even the Filipino elite women. When I've read the, I don't know whether I'm doing the right thing or not, but I'm trying to do for this new project. I read all the columns of the 4 major socialites women in the Philippines. And when they talk about their frivolous parties and all this, there's always also a section on having something Filipino. So I see a tension there between, like you said, the taste that says what is foreign is better. And the 1950s, the saying was, basta sa Paris, walang kaparis. So there's nothing better than something from Paris. But at the same time, they also are occasions when they do feel that they have to express something Filipino and buy Filipino.
Actually, I don't want to be the one talking if anybody else has something to say, but I have something reference to Manong Fred Cordova. If anybody else wants to talk first.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No one else is, raising
This
a
is
hand.
wonderful. This is wonderful. I'm really excited to mention this too. When I read your book, Mina, Uncle Fred, Manong Fred Cordova wrote his first book, and he says, The Forgotten Filipino-Americans. And you ended your book with refusing to be marginal, which is the conclusion of your book. I dropped the book and I said, Mina, Manong Fred is going to turn in his grave because you just gave him the assurance that all is all right with the Filipino-Americans in America. So you want to talk about your conclusion?
Okay, that's a good point. I don't know if all is well yet, because I think we have to be vigilant. I think we have to keep saying, but I thought I would end the book because they always think that we're marginal, we're the good migrant. I had an Italian colleague, and they said, and there's lots of Filipinos in Italy, right? They said, did they talk about the Filipinos there? Oh, no, they, because you're the good migrant, you never, you're just there. We don't, the Italians always complain about the gypsies, because they're not, but the Filipinos, they're just kind of there. So I think I made that for the conclusion. I wanted to say that words from Dean Alegado, who's first Filipino scholar, who says, "We're here, get used to it." And I think that's a theme of us migrants here, that we want host countries to accept that we're here, and thus, and that we contribute to the countries that we're in. So I gave a case study in the conclusion about a Greek school in Athens, where they started as a school for domestic workers because they wanted the children to learn Tagalog and Filipino curriculum. And so when they go back to the Philippines, they can go back to the Philippine education system. Of course, the Philippine embassy ran their own, so they had to close, and now they became a daycare. And the Greeks are ambivalent about them. On the one hand, when I went there, they got free lunch from the Greek community. But on the other hand, they keep trying to close it down. But now it's not just a daycare center for kids of Filipino domestic workers. When I went there, Filipinos were a minority. The majority were Africans and other migrants, Turkish, other migrants in Greece. And they wanted their kids to go there because why? Filipinos will teach them English. And so that for them, what the Filipinos offer, it's not just a Filipino daycare for domestic workers, but your kid's gonna learn English. So this thing has survived despite all the challenges to close it down, and I think that's kind of a story that Filipino migrants want. We don't want to be the marginal group. Just the Filipino activists in Australia, and the one in Operation Manong. That chapter I ended it by how come the activists succeeded? Because these were strong, feisty women. Amy Agbayani in Operation Manong, they kept trying to close it down in Hawaii, and she would just go to the governor and get it opened again. In Australia, these women had to deal with men who beat up their wives. So I have stories from these women that, yes, in the case of the Australia, Filipino women were overrepresented as victims of violence and homicide and domestic violence. So when Filipino activists work on their behalf, the stories they told me was the husband would come and say, "Where's that bloody Filipina who's hidden my wife, and where is she?" So it was actually, they had to be brave to put up with these sorts of things. So I think when I'm saying they're refusing to be marginal, it's a vigilance. It's like, you guys had to lobby to get Filipino-American History Month accepted. They didn't just happen. These Filipinos in Australia had to really work hard to lobby to have the law changed so that these women won't be deported. So, but I think it's a sign that the Filipinos didn't just sit down and say, okay, they're going to deport women right here in Australia. They actually did something about it, even if it required a lot of courage on their part. Same as the Filipinos in Greece. I think we all know what it's like to be a minority. We know you have to fight just to be treated equal. I know this when I first got into this university, there were 5 women out of 25 in the history department. Now there's equal. I think we even outnumber the men now, but during those times, you know what it's like. And so I think that's what I find, that Filipinos migrants. So they don't just want to accept, you know, being a marginal group. That's the reason why they're writing their stories. They want their voices heard. So that was well, I hope Uncle Fred will be happy with that. Well, it's been very successful, right? But I still think it's you have to be vigilant. And as Victoria just said, in order to get the Americans interested in a novel, you still have to give them you have to make it also about Americans, right?
Yeah, unfortunately. So, I mean, you got to be pragmatic, you know, when you're trying to build something, you give and take, you compromise, you see where you can put your foot in the door, right? And so this was my foot in the door. Why wouldn't Americans be interested in a history where they actually colonized this archipelago called the Philippine Islands? Isn't that like a great story of adventure, of voyage? I mean, it has all the elements of war and peace and love and heartbreak and struggle and revolution and idealism, you know? So I wrote
That's
it.
right. No, but that's absolutely right. You have to do these things. Like, you know, if I do even for me, when I think about a topic for a book, I can't do something totally obscure that no publisher's going to publish it, right? So
Yes.
it's always a challenge, like you said. And the thing about the Philippines, I always say we have double whammy because if you look at Indonesia, for example, the former colonizer, the Dutch, they're still very interested in Indonesia. They promote Indonesian studies. The trouble with us is that we have a former colonizer, Spain, who doesn't really care about the Philippines anymore. If you go there, they're only interested in El Siglo XVI, you know, the 16th century, which is they don't care about the Philippines. And then if you go to America, they don't want to talk about the Philippines because they want to pretend they never had colonies and they were exceptional and they didn't have an empire. So we get the double whammy where none of the colonizers really, so it's much harder for us, I think, than it is for like Indonesians.
Well, part of the Americans, I'm sorry, part of the Americans' resistance, I think, is that they're ashamed that they supported a dictator, you know?
Well,
and that most Americans didn't care to know what their government was doing to other countries. And so it's easier to sweep that under the rug. So I think the challenge for writers is, how do you stay true to the history without being so abrasive that no one would want to read your book? You know, it's always a balancing of interest. But may I just go back to what Elena said about, you know, the marginalization. I think I get you, Mina, when you say Filipinos refuse to be marginalized. And I think if we could look closely on the various generations of Filipino migrants in the United States, we might find a difference in the way the different generations view themselves, you know. And
that
I think that, right, very different. So also, I think it's because the evolution of consciousness, right? Where we say now, I refuse to be a victim, right? So I'm going to tell my story. It's going to be a story of suffering and struggle, but I refuse to tell it from the perspective of someone who's a victim. I'm going to tell it.
Yeah, it's right? a story of surviving, which means you're not a victim. And that's for me different, because if you look at the Tagalog movies about migration, I watched them all because, you know, I enjoyed some. But it's always, you know, the Calvary that culminates in the crucifixion. The migrant is a martyr. But in these stories, no, I suffered, but look at me now. So it's a slightly different view of sorry, someone else had a question?
Yeah, I was going to ask you, Mina. This is Maria.
Hello, Maria.
In terms of like the different migrant groups, are there migrants organizations that succeed because they have good leaders, and to what extent do those leaders represent the views and voices of whichever organization
Okay,
you're with?
there's a Maria, that's a good question. There's a mixture of them. Some of the migrant organizations are headed by people in the Philippines. For example, Atika, the financial runs its offices in the Philippines, but they have they're interested in making sure the migrants don't go under debt, and so they do have the perspective of the migrant because that's their cohort. But there are some that are organized by migrants themselves, so like the one in Greece and the one the ones in Italy. There's even organizations in Italy. This one's very interesting. They discovered, and that's my future once I ever get to it. In Italy, the mother goes to Italy, right, as a maid, as a domestic worker, and so the kids separated, and they have to live in with their grandparents. But in Italy, you can get permanent residency. Like in Singapore, you can't. So then eventually they claim their kids, so the kids suffer trauma twice, when the mother leaves them and when they leave their caregiver. And so there's been incidents of juvenile delinquency among children in Turin, Italy. And so there's an organization called Associazione Culturale Filippine, and they collected the children's stories. And when they published it, the mothers got upset because, these are children saying, I've been abandoned twice, and, I don't speak Italian. And so like you said, there's also this fraught thing when some of the things that come out are as Victoria was saying, not happy endings, and so then they have to talk about it. So there are these organizations that come from the migrants themselves and have to liaise and deal with this. And there's one in Venice that I haven't been to, but I contact with them. They have every year they bring somebody from La Salle in the university in the Philippines to teach Tagalog to their children, and they run some sort of. And so there's all kinds of these, Maria. It depends on whether some of them are run by, let's say, the one in Singapore is run by Singaporeans. It has to be, because you know how strict Singapore is. You can't just come up with a Filipino migrant organization. So the one in Singapore is actually by Singaporeans, but Filipino women actually have big roles. Like the one in charge of the school for migrants, she's Filipino. At least until she retired, and the one in charge of migrant health is Filipino. So there are all kinds of organizations, that some of them from the migrants themselves, and some from the host country organized. Sorry, I missed the other part of your question. How did
No, that's fine in terms of like I was just like wondering about the leadership of those migrant organizations.
okay.
Yeah,
The
it
leadership.
makes it sound as though all these Filipinos in the Philippines go to like Italy and so on, sort out the migrants in Italy. I mean, where are the migrant leaders in Italy?
The migrant leaders, they actually said some of these are the ones who are there for the longer time, and then they set up their own organizations to help. And then there's actually a Babaylan Europe, Filipino migrants, a feminist group. So they actually they just start up their own. They decide to have an organization, and then they raise money, and then some of them have connections to the local, like the one in Padova, Associazione Filipino-Culturale. What is it called? ACFI. No, there's two. There's ACFIL and Associazione Donne Filipino, Philippine women in Italy. She was somebody who was used as a translator for translating when Filipino migrants come and get caught and have to show up in court or so on. And then she formed her organization, and some of it was to also, like they have Santa Cruzan in Padova, they have to do some Filipino festivals, and sometimes it's because they go to send philanthropic things to the Philippines. So they kind of mushroom, and the leaders can be migrants themselves. All the leaders can be set up by the host country. It's not always happy, as if you're saying, the joke was always that if there's two Filipinos in a country, there'll be three organizations. So
Right.
you have, everybody wants to be president, but doesn't want to do anything, whatever. So you have the usual. So there's always plenty or organizations, and I particularly wanted to pick. There's those that just do hometown, so they lead and they're only interested in their hometown, and they raise for their hometown. They have beauty contests and so on. And then there's those that are actually have an activist, like the Filipino Women's Working Party was only for the Philippine to change the migration law, and they're now defunct. They don't exist anymore. So I had to dig up the leaders, and they succeeded. Why? Because there are only few of them. So the case studies I used for have fewer people, and so if you're talking about the leadership, it works better when they're not such a big group, because then they divided, and some of them keep changing. So the one there was one Filipino Illawarra it's about an hour and a half city in the area in Australia called the Illawarra, because a lot of Filipinos in Australia married to white Australians live in rural and remote areas. So they were a Filipino group, and now they changed it. It's called the multicultural group, and they accept Thais and others. So sometimes these organizations change, and the leaderships have to change. But it depends. And there's all kinds of. But anyone can, anyone who's willing to. So I only focused on the ones that did activism as opposed to the social ones. There's a lot of social ones also.
Does anybody have any more questions? Because we're kind of out of time.
Okay.
It's but if it anything else.
Terry, how about the Filipino-American National Historical Society?
What do you want me? Well, we announced it at the beginning. FANHS. Is there something that particular you want to interject about FANHS?
Well, about FANHS and what they consider as valuable to America and the world.
Well, FANHS is a nationwide organization where we're collecting the histories of Filipino-Americans, the ones that came here after the Spanish-American War, after the Filipino-American War, and their stories, since these guys came in the early 1900s to up to World War II. Their stories were never told, and their children are the only ones that are alive, and they're in their 80s and 90s now. So FANHS has taken upon themselves to record that history so that it won't be forgotten, so that it will be told in ethnic studies and in books. And so what Mina was talking about, being our community historians, that's what we've been doing, what FANHS has been doing. I know Anita has written a lot about her life and her father's life back in the growing up during the Depression. And so these are the stories that FANHS is collecting, because those people are not left to tell the stories, and the children who lived it with them, they're also becoming scarce. So that's FANHS's mission, is to collect all that history. So
FANHS's contribution to the world, Auntie, I would say, is I think it's a great model for all migrants to do the same thing. I don't know of any other migrant group that does it. Certainly not the, I've got a colleague here in my school who is got a big grant to do the Greeks. But you see, it's not the Greeks community who's doing the histories. The Greek community is paying him
Yeah.
to do a history of the Greeks. You see?
Well, the problem is like my father's history, how he came to the United States, being of a poor family in the hill country of La Union, and he came here because they spent a lot of time farming so he couldn't go to school. So when he went to school, he thought maybe he could get a better job. So when he went to the first grade, his teacher made him kneel on a bed of rice. So he decided he didn't want to go to school anymore. Eventually, he heard about the sugar plantation in Hawaii, and he signed up for that and went to Hawaii. And from there, he was sent to Maui in the northern part of Maui, where there's 2 plantations. After that, he left Maui and he came to the United States, coming through the port of San Pedro, which is the the, uh, the the port of Los Angeles, and then came up to the came up to Stockton. And the reason it went to Stockton is because that was a place that needed farm labor for the asparagus fields. And after that, they couldn't have any place to work. So he went to Arizona, and there he met my mother, a 16-year-old female that was born in Mexico, but her ancestry was wide and far. So they got married, and they couldn't get married in California, Nevada, or Arizona. So they went all the way to New Mexico to get married. And that was through the anti-discrimination project, where Filipinos could not marry any white women, or white men could not marry any Filipino women. So they came from there and couldn't go back to the camp that they were working on because the family was looking for them. So they came back to Stockton. Much of our heritage is through Filipino-American National Historical Society. And in here is the asparagus field with a thing on top of it that said, I eat asparagus. And I did this for our museum so that people would know about the asparagus and what the Filipinos did,
Contributions.
their contributions for,
Great idea.
because there were no people that would work on the asparagus because it was a hard breaking deal, having to bend over and cut the asparagus, not harvest, but cut. In the way they cut it, and each person had a long arm, so they had to have a special knife to cut the asparagus. So a lot of that information is in our archives and our Filipino-American history. I wrote several pages for the Filipino-American newsletter. And most of that Terry has saved, but a lot of it is also on Filipinos in the movies, because they used the movies during World War II because they couldn't have Japanese to play the role of Japanese, and that was one called Back to Bataan, and then the word Bataan. So those people, I knew of them. There were people that were working in the sets that were crowded. So there's a lot of Filipino exams here in California because we were the only place that had Filipinos. During World War II, we had the 1st and 2nd Infantry of Filipinos. Most of them came from Stockton and part of California. And most of them, of course, were Ilocanos. So there's a lot of information at our museum here in Stockton. It is a national museum of Filipinos that came to America and had no history.
I'm thinking, the great work that FANHS does, you're addressing the Filipino-Americans. You should also send to the Philippines because the Filipinos in the Philippines know nothing about Filipino-American history, really, or not.
Well, that's what that's one of the goals. And also there is a group over there who want to open up a chapter of FANHS
Oh,
over
great.
there, because they're a lot of them are the retirees that
Yes.
went back and retired, and they want to tell the history over there. So that
Yes.
this is something that FANHS is working on, because right now it's, you know, United States history, and they do want to, you know, well, it's Filipino-Americans. So they're saying, you know, Canada is part of North America, and then you
Yes.
have South America, and there's a lot of Filipinos that were down in South America and Central America. So they're looking into expanding, but again, it's a nonprofit, it's all volunteer. So, you know, there's only a handful of people that can go around, you know. So
I know. I find that astonishing. All the migrants, whatever generation, like my student was doing an honors thesis on Filipinos in Sydney and how they use the Santo Niño, the Child Jesus Festival, to inculcate Filipino values like children should be obedient and so on. And when she told me about how many hours her Ninang, her godmother, spent organizing this, you think they're all doing this voluntarily. So it really matters a lot to them. Why would you be spending all your time doing this? So it matters to them, I think. The Filipino cultures are still preserved because in the case of Australia, because a lot of Filipinos here are married to white Australians, the second generation is already, like my nephews do not speak a word of Tagalog, and it's they don't know much about their Filipino heritage, except they love going to the Philippines because when they're there, everyone says they're guapo. So that's kind of the so I think it matters, and also I think the view that if the host country and the homeland doesn't appreciate you, you have to do it yourself. So it begins by the migrants spending their time presenting a case and appreciating themselves, what they did in order to spread it around also. So
yeah.
So hopefully I'll be getting a book out on my own writings.
I hope so, Auntie Anita.
Yeah.
I hope so. You write very well, and I used your memoirs a lot, and I got a lot of ideas from Auntie Anita. The Macintosh suit, that was from Auntie Anita. You see the FANHS chapter opens with a Stockton cemetery. That was Auntie Anita.
Okay, anybody else have anything they'd like to say or add, or
I
any?
just have a comment to make. My husband is Frank Perez. He was a Filipino-American journalist. He wrote for Filipino-American newspapers from Salinas to San Francisco to Sacramento. And one of the things he said about Filipinos is that they persevere through all their struggles here in America when they arrived. No matter what the circumstance was, they persevered. And one thing I might say, Mina mentioned about division within the Filipino groups, that two big groups that I know of were divided because some other Filipinos said, I don't recognize you as president. I'm the president. So the faction split. No more Filipino community as we knew it here in Stockton. And there's no more Caballeros de Masalan. And there are other, even smaller groups, but those two that we were very much involved in are now gone. And
Well, that was because of identity as Filipinos, because the American society thought we were small groups, and we had the Masalan and Leonardo's Trabajo to show up at different placement groups like the stadium in Sacramento and the stadium here in Stockton, showing the groups and their lodges to show how many Filipinos there were here in California.
well, the situation of the CDA was mainly happened in the Bay Area. We lost our property of $1 million on Broadway that the CDA owned. Was a 2-story building. It was worth $1 million, and by the time 1996, when the CDA dissolved or disappeared because of the factions fighting in court over who's the grand master and who's the chairman of the board, and et cetera, it finally used up all the money that was in the budget. And that was almost $2 million plus the property. So that's all gone. And it went by the lawyer who took the other side, won the property because the other side couldn't finish paying the lawyer. So he has the property.
So
And
that was one of the things that, like she mentioned, like when you have 2 Filipinos, then you have 3 different groups.
yeah.
And that's why in Stockton, there was a lot of groups. And then it just, you know, everybody's kind of trying to, you know,
That's the main challenge. That's
yeah.
the main challenge for,
Yeah.
but it's not, it's a Filipino thing. You just look at the politics in the Philippines, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
So it's a challenge.
So
It goes all the way back to Jose Rizal days.
Yes, that's
When he
right.
was trying to form the La Liga Filipina, he could not get it going because everybody wanted to be whatever. So
Yes, and he resigned in
it's not
dismay.
a new thing. However, the challenge is how can we sort of stop
and
it?
there are groups, there's groups today that want to make one blanket organization to go over all Filipino organizations, but that's going to be that's too complicated. I know they're trying to do that down in LA. You know, they want to create
I
one.
think FANHS has done very well. I mean, I'll
Well,
say from my own experience, when my first job was in a rural town in Rockhampton, it's like very rural and remote. That was the only place that would hire me. Thank you for hiring me. Since I don't look like a historian, I suppose. Anyway, I thought, you know, University of Michigan would help, but anyway, that was my first job. And the Filipinos there were mostly wives of white men, migrants from marriage. And they asked me, since I used to be a professional dancer for the Bayanihan Philippine Dance Company when I was 14, you know, in the Philippines, before we immigrated. So they asked me if I could apply for a grant so that they could have a dance company and I could teach them the dance. Okay, so I organized this little dance company. And then I was trained professionally, so I only know how to train professional. That's all I know. No chewing gum during performance, no jewelry, you know. Okay, people objected to that kind of professional discipline, so 3 of them wanted to kick me out, which was and elect someone to run the company, which was very odd because shouldn't you be qualified to teach Filipino dancing? But they said, no, we used to be working in the bars and we didn't need anyone to teach us to dance. So, you know, I was it broke my heart. It broke my heart. So after that, I mean, they didn't show up for a performance, so they thought I would call them up and say, oh, hello, come back, I'll do anything you want. But I'm professionally trained. If somebody doesn't show up, you re-choreograph 1 hour before, and I can do any position of the you know, the singkil. I can do it, the bamboo clapping, nothing, everything. So we still went, but it broke my heart. And after that, I sort of have a view of what it's like. There's all these disagreements, and I mean, I just didn't understand it. And they didn't like that we had Australians in the group, but we had Australians because I argued, how will you get money from Australia? The same problem Victoria had. You need to include the white Australians. So that was why they were there. So, and the white Australians couldn't understand the Filipinos. You're getting free lessons. You're even paid to dance. You know, you're not professionals. Why would you object to? And they couldn't, they totally understood the discipline because they were all ballet students. So they knew what the you know, you don't wear jewelry on your performance, right? It's just, so I can totally understand what Marie and all of you are talking about, and Antilatrice, because that's fraught, and from my own experience. So that you'll see, I'll never join any after that.
Well, I know we could probably go on and talking about all these different things. But it's getting late. So I thank you, Mina, for doing this, and thank you everybody for showing up. And
Thanks, Mina.
And
Thank you.
And, I'm
Thanks.
hoping that we'll get other people that in this group that to do presentations in the future. So I will be in contact with you guys. So, and so Mina, any parting words that you'd like to say?
Thank everybody in FANHS for your support, especially Auntie Anita and Elena and Terry and Linda. And I also, and so I appreciate all the help and support.
Okay, well, we thank you very much. Okay,
I hope to get back to Stockton one day, but
yeah, you're welcome anytime.
I
Okay.
haven't left the state of New South Wales since
Yeah,
2020.
that's true. It's kind of hard. And hopefully in Seattle this year in August of 2022, there is a national conference.
Right.
So we're hoping that a lot of you can show up for that conference. Just stay tuned for information at the FANHS national website and or the FANHS Greater Seattle chapter, and it's on Facebook and Instagram and all that stuff. So thank you very much, everybody. And we'll put this up on YouTube at least by tomorrow. And we thank you guys again for showing up.
Thank you for
And
coming.
thank you, Mina, very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Hi, Nina. Bye, Mina.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.